thought that the prosecution had a case on paper. And I thought that in order for them to get the conviction that they were looking for, they had to walk a very delicate balance between trying to paint him as bad of a person as they could without going down too much of the road of the sex and salacious, right? Because I did think that human beings, when you put too much up in there, and I didn't, at the time, I wasn't even really thinking about the fact that RICO in and of itself is just hard for people to maybe understand, right? Because if you're looking at it on paper, he's like, okay, you got 5 charges. But if I'm not mistaken, the RICO has like some sub charges that you got to be able to prove, which is why they had the whole Kid Cudi shit up in there, right? And that to me was a perfect exposure to how weak the prosecution's case was when it came to RICO. If you have to go by hearsay without any type of legit evidence to a certain extent to establish the necessary crimes in order for the racketeering charge to take hold, right? So, that right there is telling to me, right? Because for many people in retrospect, they'll say, well, damn, this was overcharged. I think even the judge in a couple of instances mentioned like, oh, this might be a bit too much. And the question becomes why, right? Was it just solely for the interest of the public or were there other things at play, which is what then brings in all these different conspiracy theories. But nonetheless, here we are, right? Convicted on 2 charges, which I think most people, like, yeah, he's probably going to get these, right? To Jay's point, these were like layups, right? For the most part. And that was probably the best that Diddy could hope for in terms of, okay, you know what? They got me on this one, right? But I think a lot of people look at the legal process and are suspicious, especially when it comes to Black men. It's really hard to kind of separate where the legality stops or starts and where the concerns for how the misapplication of the legal system is to us, which is why you always hear that conversation between Harvey Weinstein and this person. So in this particular case, however, I don't know that people can make that case, right? People can say that this case was tried somewhat fairly, I guess as best as it could have been. We weren't in the courtroom, and maybe that was what makes this not the case of the century to me. To a certain extent, I get that maybe we're early in the century and there's not a lot of other stuff to look at here. But overall, and there was some high stakes here, but we didn't get a chance to be a part of the drama. So we're hearing kind of second and third hand, ultimately, of what's being had in the courtroom. And I think a lot of people just kind of felt like this whole thing was kind of a overcharge in the first place. So there's a lot of people who are vindicated by this outcome. There's a lot of people who are distraught, right? To S&M's point. And I want to just speak to them before we brought it up. Because the thing that hurts me for y'all, right? And I care for these women, is that somehow you confuse and conflate things, right? This wasn't an expression of your experience. This wasn't an expression probably of many people's experience, because we're talking about rich and wealthy people that many people do not have access to, right? There's a certain level of lifestyle and cachet and things that are happening that I'll just openly and honestly admit that I don't know about. We hear rumors about what happens in these celebrity parties all the time, but we act like we know these people and we don't. That's why my position was always, whether it's Cassie or Diddy for that matter, I don't know these people. So I couldn't get emotionally invested in people I didn't know. And I just think it's unhealthy for the women to do that. I get why. This is not, this just proves why women shouldn't speak. Really? Really? Because y'all Cassie, y'all shaved the half of y'all head too, huh? Y'all was calling prostitutes on the back pages and shit, huh? Like, come on, y'all. Like, is there an issue? Absolutely. Right? Do women need to speak up? Absolutely. But in this particular case, the waters were so muddy that I feel like you're only getting yourself dirty by wading in them, because the rest of us, or some of us, can separate it for what it was. You know what I'm saying? So I get it. But because I love y'all, I just think y'all misplace y'all faith, or y'all misplace y'all projection into people and things that got absolutely nothing to do with you and couldn't be farthest from who you are and where you are in life. All I'm saying is that this is a lot here, right? And so that's why I kind of want to open up, because aside from I want to ask y'all this first, because we're not necessarily surprised. I will say I was somewhat surprised that the judge didn't grant him bail, right? Because the way I kind of understood it to a certain extent, at this point, the case is kind of over. They say that I think a letter from Cassie might have swayed the judge, right? Which to me, okay, I get it. They're saying that he's violent, and so therefore he shouldn't be allowed to maybe get bail or whatever. But I think if you're talking about the charges he was actually convicted of, with a maximum of 10 years, and he's a first time offender, if I'm not mistaken. So what do y'all think about that in terms of the judge making that choice? And do you think it can give us any signs as to how this lands, right? Because I think it's taken for granted that the two cases that he was found guilty of would be concurrent, or, because they could be consecutive. The way I read consecutive is he could do a 20 piece, right? Versus if they decide to make it concurrent, and then you take time served and then his record. So some people thought realistically that he could be released today under bail. So what are y'all thoughts in terms of him being denied bail? And then also the outpouring of what seems like sympathy, right, for some people in regards to this case, almost as if Diddy is like some hero who was just nailed to the cross, and through legal wizardry, he was able to, you know what I'm saying? What are y'all thoughts about that?
A couple of things. I want to push back on what S&M said about the sex trafficking. It wasn't sex trafficking because typically in sex trafficking, the people who are being trafficked are being deprived, they're being mistreated, they're being malnourished. And in Cassie's case and in Jane's case, they were living quite lavish, which is the opposite of what happens when you're sex trafficked. People don't give you caviar and put you on jets and do da 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 da, typically. So I think that's probably why the sex trafficking thing fell through. They're where they couldn't find the coercion. So that's my pushback on that. And answer to your question, Nick, about man, I was so ready to push back on that.
With
Okay.
the coercion part?
Yeah.
Well, I want to push back on that though. If you're going
Go
to push
ahead.
back on the sex trafficking, because what they're saying is that if it's coercive, right, and you can use money as an inducement or an enticement for it to be coercive, right? If a person is used to a certain thing and you then threaten to take that away, that could then be deemed that way. That's why I feel like, honestly, on paper, I think there was necessarily a case. To your point, and probably to what S&M said earlier, the question became whether or not people believed that in the instances of the two people who are at the core of this those charges, if it was voluntary or they were consensual. But the
The jury
problem
did.
is that's why you would hear people say things like you can consent 4 times, but not the fifth, right? They were trying to draw the distinction that yes, maybe we were in a relationship, but people in a relationship can get SA'd, right? And so they were trying to walk that delicate balance. And I think that's why that's what the charges were about. But I just think the jury just didn't buy that part. They couldn't, or they didn't separate between, or what the prosecutors wanted them to do, which was separate between, yes, they were in a relationship, they loved each other, but he also did this fucked up shit.
I think the jury did hear it. I think the jury listened. The jury said, you know what? Jane and Cassie are call girls. They're not victims. They were in it for some money. They got some money. They didn't like the treatment or whatever, but it didn't change their uh prostitution status. Oh,
Well, hold on,
listen,
but hold on.
go ahead.
Whoa,
So,
whoa, whoa, hold
so
on, S&M, hold on, S&M, hold on. You're saying that they automatically, because of their choice, that they looked at both of them as prostitutes?
I'm saying that when the verdict was given,
Uh-huh.
the jury basically looked at the evidence and said, "You ladies are not victims. You ladies have conducted yourselves as prostitutes, and so it's prostitution,
Wow.
but it's not sex trafficking."
Okay, I got to push back on that, my brother.
Go ahead.
I got to push back. Is it possible that they just couldn't separate the idea that there were times that these women were in relationships and consented to, right, certain things, and that there were times that they did not? That does not necessarily mean they had to
Possible.
view them as prostitutes, right? Am I missing something?
no, so I concur with this
Okay.
because one, the reaction from supposedly some of the jurors was the fact that they identified that there was a relationship for one person in particular. The other person was transactional. Now, one of the reasons why domestic violence laws came about and was because women were being abused in relationships, regardless, because it used to be where, oh, it's not abusive because this is my partner. It's not abusive because this is my wife or whatnot. And so that's the line that Nick was talking about in regards to trying to differentiate when they crossed that line, when he crossed that line. In regards to the general public, i.e. women's reaction, it was more or less like, okay, so he's convicted of prostitution, but not sex trafficking. But wouldn't sex trafficking have fallen under prostitution in some way, somehow?
No.
And so I agree it doesn't. That's why I said in my statement that I already knew he wasn't going to be convicted of sex trafficking simply because they already viewed it as a transactional relationship. If they would have tried this before Cassie got paid out millions of dollars, she would have had a better chance, or the state actually, or the feds would have had a better chance of winning. But because she got paid out so much money and then she got paid out from the hotel, and it was like, well, she benefited from this, and people don't like to say that he's guilty when it was paid out. And they was in a relationship, and she acknowledged that she willingly participated. That's why I said I didn't view it as sex trafficking. I'm saying the women of the internet was like, wait, how can you be convicted of prostitution on demand, but not sex trafficking? That's where their confusion lies.